The early morning sun painted a golden hue over Willow Creek Park, its gentle warmth slowly chasing away the lingering chill of dawn. The park was coming to life with joggers, dog walkers, and parents pushing strollers along the winding paths. Birds chirped from the tall oak trees, their songs blending into the distant hum of the city. Sitting on his favorite bench near the fountain, Nathaniel Reed let out a content sigh as he took a sip of his steaming coffee. His weathered hands, strong despite his years, cradled the cup carefully while his neatly folded newspaper rested on his lap. The park had been part of his daily ritual for over 30 years. It was more than just a place to relax, it was a sanctuary, a piece of history that held stories of a lifetime spent in Willow Creek. His eyes, framed by deep lines of wisdom, scanned the headline of the morning paper. He had seen the world change, watched his neighborhood grow and shift. Some changes had been for the better, others not so much. Still, he believed in the power of progress. The crunch of gravel under heavy boots caught his attention. Looking up, he saw a young officer striding towards him. Nathaniel had seen him around a few times before but had never exchanged words with him. The officer's uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, and his gaze sharp with an air of authority. His name tag read Calloway. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Calloway said, stopping in front of Nathaniel's bench. His tone wasn't overtly hostile, but there was a distinct edge to it. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Nathaniel blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Good morning, officer," he greeted politely, his voice deep yet soft with age. "I'm just enjoying my coffee and reading the paper. Same as I do every morning." Calloway's eyes narrowed slightly. "You live around here?" he pressed. Nathaniel nodded, sitting up a little straighter. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, young man. Just a few blocks down." Calloway's stance didn't relax. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest, a skeptical expression forming on his face. "I haven't seen you here before." Nathaniel let out a small, weary sigh. He had been here every morning, in this same spot, yet here he was, being questioned as if he were trespassing. "Perhaps you weren't looking," he said simply. The officer's jaw tensed. "Do you have any ID on you?" Nathaniel slowly placed his coffee cup down on the bench. He wasn't about to be bullied in a place that felt like home to him. "I wasn't aware I needed to carry ID to sit in a public park," he replied calmly. Calloway's patience was wearing thin. "Look, sir, we've had reports of loitering in the area. I need to verify that you have a right to be here." Nathaniel's grip on his cane tightened slightly. Loitering? That word, often used as a weapon against people like him, stung more than the officer realized. His voice remained measured, but there was an undeniable firmness behind it. "A right to be here? I helped design this park. I fought for this space to be built. I planted some of these trees with my own hands. And now you're telling me I don't belong?" Calloway scoffed, clearly not believing a word. "Yeah, right," he muttered. "And I'm the mayor." Nathaniel took a deep breath, willing himself to remain composed. He had faced worse in his lifetime. He had marched for civil rights, endured more blatant forms of discrimination, and spent decades working to build bridges within his community. But no matter how much progress had been made, moments like this reminded him that the fight was far from over. "I'm asking you one last time, sir," Calloway said, his patience wearing thin. "Either show me some ID or I'll have to ask you to leave." Nathaniel stared at the young officer, seeing something beyond the arrogance, ignorance, perhaps, or a sense of misplaced authority that came from inexperience. "And what happens if I don't?" he asked, his voice steady. Calloway's eyes darkened. "Then I'll have to take you in for trespassing and resisting an officer." Nathaniel chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Trespassing? In a public park?" He shook his head in disbelief. "Young man, you have no idea what you're doing." Calloway's patience snapped. Without another word, he reached for Nathaniel's arm, yanking him up from the bench. The sudden motion sent a sharp jolt through Nathaniel's shoulder, causing him to stumble slightly. His cane clattered to the ground. "Hey! There's no need for that," a bystander shouted. A few people nearby stopped, watching the confrontation unfold. Some had already pulled out their phones, recording the scene. But before Calloway could slap the handcuffs on Nathaniel, a firm, authoritative voice rang through the park. "That's enough." Calloway froze. The voice was deep, steady, and carried a weight of command that couldn't be ignored. Turning, he saw Captain Lawrence Hayes approaching, his uniform distinguished with the marks of high rank. His expression was unreadable, but his dark brown eyes burned with quiet intensity. "Sir," Calloway started, but Hayes raised a hand, silencing him. "I said that's enough," Hayes repeated, stepping closer. His gaze flicked to Nathaniel, then back to Calloway. "Release him. Now." Reluctantly, Calloway let go of Nathaniel's arm. The older man rolled his shoulder, wincing slightly but not giving Calloway the satisfaction of seeing pain on his face. Hayes turned fully toward Nathaniel, his voice softer now. "Are you all right, Mr. Reed?" Nathaniel exhaled, his heartbeat still slightly elevated from the encounter. "I'll be fine, Captain Hayes. Thank you." Calloway's face twisted in confusion. "Wait, you know him?" Hayes turned to Calloway with a look so sharp it could cut steel. "Of course, I do. Mr. Reed isn't just some man sitting in a park. He's a respected member of this community. A man who has done more for this neighborhood than you can begin to imagine." Calloway's posture stiffened. He glanced around at the people watching, the cameras recording. The weight of his mistake was beginning to settle on him. I was just following protocol," he muttered. Hayes' jaw clenched. "No, you weren't. You saw an elderly black man sitting alone and assumed he didn't belong. That's not protocol, that's profiling." He took a step closer. "And we don't do that here." Silence hung in the air. Calloway swallowed hard, his face flushing under the weight of his superior's words. "This isn't over," Hayes said. "We'll talk about this back at the station." Nathaniel slowly bent down to pick up his cane. Hayes immediately moved to help him, but Nathaniel shook his head. "I got it." He straightened, looking at Calloway one last time. "Young man," he said, his voice heavy with meaning, "you have a lot to learn." With that, he turned and walked away, his steps slow but steady. The world had changed, but not enough. And today was just another reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. Nathaniel walked away from the confrontation, his grip tightening around his cane as he moved towards the quieter part of the park. His heart still pounded from the exchange, but his face remained calm, unreadable. Years of experience had taught him that moments like these were inevitable, no matter how much progress had been made. He had lived long enough to see laws change, attitudes shift, and communities grow, yet there was always someone ready to question his place in a world he had helped shape. Captain Hayes watched Nathaniel go, his own expression clouded with frustration. He had known Nathaniel Reed since childhood. The man was a cornerstone of the community, someone who had fought for this very park to exist. It infuriated him to see an officer under his command treating Nathaniel with such blatant disrespect. Hayes turned back to Calloway, who stood stiffly, his face a mix of embarrassment and defensiveness. "Walk with me," Hayes ordered, gesturing towards the pathway. Calloway hesitated before following his superior, his boots crunching against the gravel. The weight of the crowd's judgment still hung in the air, their murmurs and stares lingering even as they began to disperse. "You made a serious mistake today," Hayes said, his voice calm but firm. "I was just trying to do my job, sir," Calloway argued. "We've had reports of..." "Reports of what?" Hayes interrupted, stopping in his tracks and turning to face him. "People sitting on park benches? Drinking coffee? Reading the newspaper?" His voice dripped with disbelief. Calloway clenched his jaw. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem," Hayes shot back. "It shouldn't matter who he was. You saw an older black man alone in a park, and instead of assuming he was a resident, you assumed he was a problem. Why?" Calloway looked away, shifting uncomfortably. "I don't know," he admitted after a moment. Hayes exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You're new here, I get that. But if you want to be a good cop, you need to learn this community. Nathaniel Reed isn't just a resident, he's a part of the foundation of this city. That man fought for things you take for granted, things I take for granted. And today, you treated him like a trespasser in his own home." Calloway swallowed hard, but he didn't argue. He could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him now, heavier with each word Hayes spoke. "Look," Hayes continued, his voice softening just slightly. "I'm not saying you're a bad cop. But you need to understand something, your badge isn't a shield against accountability. If you're not willing to question your own biases, you're going to do more harm than good. And I won't allow that under my watch." Calloway nodded, his shoulders dropping slightly. "I get it," he muttered. "Do you?" Hayes asked, narrowing his eyes. Because you're going to do more than just get it. You're going to make it, right? Calloway frowned. How? Hayes gave him a pointed look. You'll start by apologizing to Nathaniel. Calloway tensed, looking down the pathway where Nathaniel had disappeared. Now, he asked, hesitating. Yes. Now, Hayes said firmly. And after that, you're going to learn about the man you disrespected today. Because if you don't, you'll never be the kind of officer this city deserves. Calloway took a deep breath and nodded. Without another word, he turned and started walking in the direction Nathaniel had gone. Hayes watched him for a moment before shaking his head and exhaling sharply. There was hope for the kid, but only if he was willing to put in the work. Meanwhile, Nathaniel had settled on another bench further down the park, staring out at the small pond where ducks glided across the water. He could still feel the tension in his muscles, but he refused to let it ruin his morning. He had endured much worse in his life. Still, a weariness settled over him, heavier than the cane in his hand. Footsteps approached, hesitant but deliberate. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Mr. Reed? Calloway's voice was quieter this time, less rigid. Nathaniel inhaled slowly before looking up, his sharp eyes meeting Calloway's uncertain gaze. He didn't say anything, just waited. Calloway cleared his throat. I just wanted to apologize, he said, his voice lacking its earlier bravado. I shouldn't have treated you the way I did. I misjudged the situation. Nathaniel studied him for a long moment. He had heard apologies before, some genuine, others forced. He could tell Calloway was uncomfortable, but there was something else in his expression now, something resembling reflection. Sit down, Nathaniel said, nodding to the empty spot beside him. Calloway hesitated before slowly lowering himself onto the bench, sitting stiffly as if the very act made him uneasy. You're new to this neighborhood, Nathaniel said, more as a statement than a question. Yes, sir, Calloway admitted. Transferred in a few months ago. Nathaniel nodded, his gaze returning to the pond. You ever hear the history of this park? Calloway frowned slightly. Not really. Nathaniel let out a quiet chuckle. Figures. This park didn't always exist. Used to be an abandoned lot, full of nothing but weeds and broken glass. The city didn't care about it, just left it to rot. But the people in this neighborhood? They cared. We fought for this land to be turned into something beautiful, a place where families could come together. Calloway listened, his expression unreadable. I spent years working to make this happen, Nathaniel continued, his voice carrying the weight of those memories. I sat through city council meetings, went door to door gathering signatures. And when they finally built this park, I made sure I was one of the first to plant a tree right here. He turned to Calloway then, his dark brown eyes locking onto the younger man's. So you understand why I take offense when someone tells me I don't belong here. Calloway swallowed hard. I do now. Nathaniel nodded slowly, letting silence settle between them. Finally, he exhaled. I accept your apology, Officer Calloway. But an apology isn't enough. You need to do better. Learn the people you serve. See them for who they are, not who you assume them to be. Calloway absorbed the words, nodding. I will, he said, and for the first time, he truly meant it. Nathaniel leaned back, his gaze returning to the water. Good. Then maybe next time, we'll talk over coffee instead of handcuffs. A small, sheepish smile tugged at Calloway's lips. I'd like that, Mr. Reed. As they sat in silence, the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over Willow Creek Park. Change didn't happen overnight, Nathaniel knew. But sometimes, it started with a conversation. Nathaniel remained on the bench long after Calloway had left, watching the gentle ripples in the pond. He wasn't sure if the young officer had truly learned a lesson or if he was just going through the motions to appease his superior, but time would tell. He had seen men like Calloway before, young, eager to prove themselves, but carrying blind spots they hadn't yet acknowledged. Some grew beyond them, some never did. With a heavy sigh, he pushed himself to his feet, gripping his cane for support. The stiffness in his knees reminded him that his days of moving freely were long behind him, but he refused to let time steal his dignity. He began his slow walk home, nodding to familiar faces along the way. This neighborhood had changed over the years, yet there were still traces of the past in its foundations, ones that people like Calloway failed to recognize. By the time Nathaniel reached his modest house on Maple Street, the afternoon sun had begun its descent. The front yard, though small, was neat, with bright flowers lining the short pathway to the door. He unlocked it and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of old books and warm coffee. The living room was filled with reminders of his past, framed photographs of marches, newspaper clippings documenting the park's opening, and a plaque recognizing his service to the community. He set his cane against the wall and settled into his favorite chair by the window. His body was tired, but his mind raced. The morning's incident had rattled something loose inside him, a memory buried beneath the decades. A younger version of himself, standing in a crowded meeting hall, arguing with city officials about the importance of community spaces. The skepticism on their faces, the way they dismissed his words as the complaints of a man demanding too much. He had fought hard to prove them wrong, had rallied the people of Willow Creek to stand beside him, refusing to be ignored. And yet, here he was, all these years later, still having to prove his place in his own neighborhood. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced at the clock, it was nearly evening. He wasn't expecting visitors. With a groan, he pushed himself up and made his way to the door, opening it cautiously. Captain Hayes stood on the porch, his expression unreadable. "Evening, Mr. Reed," Hayes greeted. Nathaniel studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "Come on in." Hayes entered, glancing around the living room. He had been here before, years ago, when he was still just a rookie officer learning the ropes. Back then, he had sat on that very couch, listening to Nathaniel's stories about the civil rights movement, about the struggles and victories of a past that still echoed in the present. Nathaniel lowered himself back into his chair, watching Hayes carefully. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Hayes sat across from him, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "I wanted to check in on you. See how you were doing after this morning." Nathaniel scoffed, shaking his head. "I'm old, not fragile, son. Takes more than a young fool with a badge to shake me." Hayes exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know. But that doesn't make it right." Nathaniel nodded but said nothing. There was a beat of silence before Hayes continued. "Calloway's shaken up about what happened. I think he's starting to understand how badly he messed up." Nathaniel smirked slightly. "We'll see. Understanding something in the moment doesn't mean it'll stick." Hayes leaned back. "I want to make sure it does." That caught Nathaniel's attention. He raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Hayes hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I'm implementing new community training for my officers. Real training. Not just a slideshow about bias that they'll forget by the time they leave the room. I want them to know this neighborhood, to hear from the people who built it, who live in it. And I was hoping," he paused, meeting Nathaniel's gaze. "I was hoping you'd help." Nathaniel blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He had spent most of his life advocating for change, for progress, but he hadn't expected to be asked to take such an active role at this stage in his life. "You want me to teach your officers how to see us as human?" he asked, his tone measured. "Yes," Hayes said without hesitation. "Because they should have already known, and I won't let ignorance be an excuse anymore." Nathaniel let out a slow breath, tapping his fingers against the armrest of his chair. He had spent so many years fighting for change, and now, here was an opportunity to shape the minds of those who held power in his community. But was he willing to step into that battle again? Hayes seemed to sense his hesitation. "I know I'm asking a lot, Mr. Reed. And I know you've already done more than your share. But the truth is, we need you. The next generation needs you." Nathaniel studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity. But he found none. Hayes meant every word. Finally, Nathaniel exhaled through his nose. "All right," he said, voice steady. "I'll do it. But on my terms." Hayes nodded. "Of course." Nathaniel leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking onto the captain's. "First, I'm not doing this alone. I want young voices involved. People like Chinas, Marcus, kids who know what it's like to grow up here, who've lived through the good and the bad. If we're going to change the way these officers see this community, they need to hear from more than just an old man." Hayes nodded again. "That's a great idea." "Second," Nathaniel continued, "this isn't a one-time thing. If we're going to do this, it needs to be ongoing. Regular meetings, real discussions, not just some yearly formality." Hayes smiled slightly. "I was hoping you'd say that." Nathaniel settled back into his chair. "Then I guess we have a deal." Hayes stood, extending his hand. Nathaniel eyed it for a moment before shaking it, his grip firm despite the years. "I'll be in touch with the details," Hayes said, making his way towards the door. Nathaniel nodded. "You do that." As the door shut behind the captain, Nathaniel sat in silence for a long moment. The weight of history rested heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was never easy, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was still possible. And if that were true, then his fight wasn't over yet. Nathaniel stood at his window long after Captain Hayes had left, watching the last golden streaks of sunlight fade beyond the rooftops. The neighborhood was quiet, the occasional distant murmur of laughter or the sound of a car passing by breaking the stillness. He had lived here long enough to remember when the streets weren't so quiet, when every step outside was met with a fight to be seen, heard, and acknowledged. Change had come, but never fast enough. The idea of standing in front of a room full of officers, some of whom probably carried the same biases as Calloway, weighed on him. He had spent his youth trying to change minds, trying to prove that a man's worth wasn't determined by the color of his skin. And here he was, all these years later, being asked to do it again. He let out a slow sigh. Maybe it was foolish to think that the fight would ever truly be over. The next morning, Nathaniel made his way to Willow Creek Community Center. It had once been an abandoned building before the neighborhood banded together and transformed it into a space where kids could study, families could gather, and programs could be run for those who needed them most. It was one of the few places in the city that still felt untouched by corporate hands, still belonged to the people. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of fresh coffee and old books. The center's director, Teresa Holloway, greeted him at the front desk with a warm smile. "Mr. Reed," she said, her eyes lighting up. "What a surprise. Haven't seen you here in a while." Nathaniel nodded, adjusting his grip on his cane. "Been meaning to stop by. Just needed the right reason." She gestured toward the hallway. "Well, you know you're always welcome. What brings you in today?" Nathaniel hesitated before answering. "I need to speak with some of the younger folks. Got a new project I'm working on, and I need their voices in the room." Teresa's eyes narrowed slightly, curiosity flickering across her face. "Sounds serious." "It is." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I think I know just the people you're looking for." Nathaniel followed her down the hall to a meeting room where a handful of young adults were gathered around a table, engaged in a spirited discussion. At the head of the table sat Marcus Gaines, a sharp-minded activist with a natural presence that made people listen when he spoke. Next to him was Chinis Moore, a single mother who had made it her mission to fight for safer streets and better schools for her son's future. There was also Jamal, a high school senior who had been organizing student-led town halls, and Maria, a college student studying criminal justice who wanted to reform the system from within. The conversation hushed as Teresa and Nathaniel stepped inside. Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Mr. Reed," he said, nodding. "Didn't expect to see you here." Nathaniel smirked. "Figured it was time." Chinis glanced between them. "Something tells me this isn't a social visit." "It's not," Nathaniel admitted. He took a seat at the table, placing his hands flat against the surface. "I need your help." That got their attention. Nathaniel Reed wasn't the type to ask for help unless it truly mattered. "I've been asked to work with the police department," he continued. "They want me to talk to officers about this community. About the history, the struggles, the people they claim to protect." His eyes flicked to Marcus. "But I don't just want them to hear from me. They need to hear from all of you, too." The room fell silent for a moment. Then Marcus let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "So, let me get this straight. You want us to sit in a room full of cops and convince them that we deserve to be treated like human beings? That's what we're doing now." "It's more than that," Nathaniel said evenly. "You and I both know that Calloway isn't the only officer with his mindset. We can't change every heart, but we can plant the seed. We can show them what they refuse to see. And if we do that, if even one officer leaves that room looking at this community differently, it's a start." Jamal tapped his fingers against the table. "I don't know, man. These cops don't listen to us when we're out on the streets. What makes you think they'll listen to us in a meeting?" Maria, who had been quiet up until that moment, finally spoke. "Because this time, they have no choice. If the police department invited Mr. Reed, they're at least willing to listen. And if we go in there prepared, if we present our reality in a way they can't ignore, then maybe we can make them see what we've known our whole lives. Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing his chin. And what if they don't? Then we make them uncomfortable, Nathaniel said simply. We make sure they remember us long after we leave that room. Chinis leaned forward, clasping her hands together. All right? Let's say we do this. What's the plan? Nathaniel nodded approvingly. We start by sharing our stories. Real stories. Not just numbers and statistics, but lived experiences. Things they can't dismiss. Then we challenge them. Ask them questions that force them to reflect, to confront their own biases. Maria perked up. I can pull some data from the department's own reports. Show them the numbers that prove racial disparities exist in their policing. And I can talk about growing up in this neighborhood, Marcus added. How we get stopped for just existing. Chinis' expression hardened. And I'll talk about what it's like raising a son in a world where I have to teach him how to survive an encounter with the police before he's even old enough to ride a bike. Jamal nodded. And I'll bring the perspective of the next generation. Let them know we're watching. That we're not just gonna sit back and let this keep happening. Nathaniel felt a surge of pride as he listened to them strategize. This was exactly what he had hoped for, a group of young people ready to take the fight forward. Then it's settled, he said. We meet next week. And we make sure that when we walk into that room, we make them listen. As the meeting wrapped up and the young leaders dispersed, Nathaniel lingered for a moment, letting the weight of what they were about to do settle in. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But as he stepped out into the warm evening air, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. Nathaniel arrived at the police station earlier than expected, his mind sharper than ever despite the weight of the years behind him. The sun had barely crested the skyline, casting long golden rays through the city streets. It was a different kind of battlefield today, one fought with words, ideas, and the courage to stand firm in the face of opposition. He had done this before, but there was something different about today. This wasn't just about him. It was about Marcus, Chinis, Jamal, Maria, and every young person coming up behind them. He adjusted his tie and stepped through the glass doors, nodding briefly at the officer stationed behind the desk. A glance around the lobby told him all he needed to know. The tension in the air was thick, an unspoken divide between the officers preparing for their day and the civilians waiting for assistance. He knew what some of them thought, that he was a relic of a bygone era, a man whose fight had been fought and won decades ago. But he also knew better. A door opened down the hall, and Captain Hayes stepped out, his expression unreadable. Mr. Reed, he greeted, extending a hand. You're early. Nathaniel shook his hand firmly. Habit, he replied. Always like to get a feel for the room before stepping into it. Hayes nodded, leading him down the hall. Your group is waiting in the conference room. We've got a full house today, officers from all across the district. Nathaniel could hear the low murmur of voices before they even reached the door. He braced himself as they stepped inside, immediately scanning the room. About 24 officers were seated at the long table, their expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to outright skepticism. Some leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, while others sat stiffly, watching him like he was an exhibit. And then there were his people. Marcus, Chinis, Jamal, and Maria sat at the far end of the room, their backs straight, eyes focused. They had come prepared, and Nathaniel could see it in the way they held themselves. They weren't here to plead for understanding. They were here to be heard. Hayes gestured for Nathaniel to take the floor, stepping aside but staying close enough to intervene if needed. Nathaniel cleared his throat, letting his gaze sweep over the room before speaking. Let's get one thing straight before we start, he said, his voice steady. I didn't come here to preach. And I didn't come here to be anyone's enemy. What I did come here to do is have a conversation, a real one. And whether or not this is a waste of everyone's time depends entirely on you. A few of the officers shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. Nathaniel continued. You all know why we're here. Because of what happened in the park that morning. Because of the choices Officer Calloway made. Some of you might be thinking it was just one mistake, one incident that got blown out of proportion. But let me ask you something, if you had seen what I've seen, lived through what I've lived through, would you still think it was just a mistake? The room was silent. Nathaniel let the question linger before he nodded to Marcus. "This is Marcus Gaines," he said. "He grew up right here in this district. And he's got something to say." Marcus stood, rolling his shoulders back. He didn't look nervous, he looked ready. He scanned the room, letting his gaze land on the officers one by one. "I was 14 the first time I got stopped by the police," Marcus began. "I was walking home from basketball practice. Had my gym bag slung over my shoulder, earbuds in, minding my business. A patrol car rolled up beside me. 2 officers got out, told me to put my hands where they could see them. A few officers in the room shifted, but no one interrupted. They said I matched a description," Marcus continued. "Asked me where I was coming from, where I was going. I told them. Didn't matter. They made me sit on the curb while they ran my name. People I knew walked past, staring, whispering. By the time they let me go, I wasn't thinking about basketball anymore. I was thinking about how I never wanted to feel that small again." Silence. Marcus's jaw tightened. That wasn't the last time, either. And it wasn't just me. It was my friends. My cousins. My neighbors. Always the same story. "You fit the description. You looked suspicious. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time." And every time, it chipped away at the idea that we could ever just exist in our own city without being seen as a problem first. Nathaniel could see it now, the flickers of discomfort in the officers' expressions. Some of them looked down. Others clenched their jaws. But they were listening. Chena stood next. "I have a son," she said, her voice clear but heavy with emotion. "He's 5 now. And I already have to think about the conversations I'm gonna have with him in a few years. How to move, how to speak, what to do if he ever gets stopped. You know how heartbreaking that is? To know that I have to teach my son how to survive an encounter before I ever get to teach him how to drive." She shook her head, swallowing hard. "This isn't just about one incident in a park. This is about years, decades, of being seen as a threat before being seen as a person." Jamal and Maria followed, bringing their own stories and statistics, backing up every word with hard evidence. By the time they finished, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Some officers still looked skeptical, unwilling to let go of their defenses. But others looked thoughtful, troubled even. Nathaniel took a step forward, resting his hands on the table. "We're not asking you to fix everything overnight," he said. "We're asking you to acknowledge it. To do better. Because whether you realize it or not, your choices have weight. The way you see us affects the way you treat us. And the way you treat us affects the way we see you." He let out a slow breath. "This can be different. But that starts with you." The room remained still for a long moment. Then, finally, an older officer at the end of the table spoke. "I've been on this force for 20 years, he said. "I've seen a lot, heard a lot. And I'll admit, I never thought about it from your side like this." He looked at Marcus. "That's not an easy thing to talk about, son. And I respect you for saying it." A few murmurs of agreement followed. Not a complete shift, but something. Captain Hayes finally stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I think we all have a lot to reflect on," he said. "And I appreciate you all coming here to speak with us." Nathaniel nodded, catching the eyes of his team. They had done what they came to do. As they stepped out of the conference room, Marcus let out a low breath. "Think it made a difference?" he asked. Nathaniel gave him a small, knowing smile. "We planted the seed," he said. "Now we see if they let it grow." Nathaniel stepped out of the police station, the cool morning air brushing against his face as the tension from the meeting slowly settled in his chest. Marcus, Chena, Jamal, and Maria followed closely behind, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and cautious hope. The meeting had been tough, but necessary. He could see it in the faces of some of those officers, the way their defenses had cracked, even if just slightly. It wasn't a victory, but it was a start. Chena rubbed her arms, glancing back at the station. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that they actually listened," she said. "At least some of them." "They listened because they had to," Jamal muttered. "Because they were forced to sit there and hear us out. Doesn't mean they'll actually change." Nathaniel turned to them, his steady gaze grounding them. "Change isn't instant," he said. "It's not about one meeting, one speech, or even one policy shift. It's about planting the right ideas and making sure they don't get buried." Maria exhaled, shaking her head. "It just feels like we've had this same conversation so many times before. And every time, we hope things will be different. They can be, Nathaniel assured her. But we have to keep pushing. Marcus folded his arms across his chest, his jaw clenched. Yeah, but how long do we have to keep pushing before something actually happens? Before we stop having to prove that we belong in our own neighborhoods? Nathaniel looked at him, seeing not just frustration but exhaustion, the same exhaustion he had seen in young men for decades. The feeling of fighting the same fight over and over, never knowing if the effort was making a dent. He understood it all too well. As long as it takes, Nathaniel said simply. Because if we stop, then nothing changes. They stood there for a moment, letting his words sink in. The streets were starting to wake up, the city moving forward as if nothing had happened. But they knew better. Today had been another step in a much longer journey. Chena sighed, checking her phone. We should probably head out, she said. I need to pick up my son from my mom's place. Maria nodded. And I have class in an hour. Jamal stretched, cracking his neck. Yeah, and I have to get to work before my boss finds a reason to cut my hours again. Nathaniel smiled at them, proud of the way they carried themselves. Go on, he said. We'll meet again soon. This isn't over. As they parted ways, Nathaniel turned down the street, his mind already racing with the next steps. The meeting with the officers had been a necessary step, but it wasn't the only one. He had more work to do. By the time he reached Oakwood Park, the familiar sounds of life greeted him, children laughing, dogs barking, joggers pacing along the paths. It was a stark contrast to the tension of the morning, but Nathaniel found comfort in it. This park had always been a place of solace for him, a reminder of both the struggles and the victories of his past. He settled onto his usual bench, exhaling as he let the weight of the morning settle over him. His fingers tapped idly against the armrest as he thought about what came next. Heavy morning, a voice interrupted his thoughts. Nathaniel looked up to see Raymond Mitchell, the police chief, standing a few feet away. Dressed in his uniform, his expression was unreadable, though there was something in his eyes that suggested he had been thinking just as much as Nathaniel had. You could say that, Nathaniel replied, gesturing to the empty spot beside him. Raymond hesitated before taking the seat, his posture rigid. I heard about the meeting, he said. Some officers thought it was a waste of time. Others said it was the first real conversation they've had about race since joining the force. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. And you? What do you think? Raymond exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I think you did something today that I should have done a long time ago. Nathaniel watched him, reading between the lines. Raymond wasn't just talking about today. He was talking about everything, the years of systemic issues, the silent complicity, the times he had chosen to look the other way rather than challenge the culture within his own department. It's not too late, Nathaniel said. You still have the power to change things from the inside. Raymond's jaw tightened. I'm trying. But the problem runs deep. Some of these officers, they don't even realize the biases they carry. Others? They don't care to change. Then you deal with the ones who are willing, Nathaniel said. And you make sure the ones who aren't don't have the power to keep hurting people. Raymond let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. I need your help, Nathaniel. I don't just want to talk about change. I want to implement it. Training programs, community engagement, real consequences for officers who abuse their power. I want to start with that, but I need people like you to help build trust. Nathaniel studied him for a long moment. He had spent a lifetime fighting for justice, and now here was an opportunity to create something lasting. He had seen promises before, empty words spoken by people who wanted to appease the community without real action. But looking into Raymond's eyes, he saw something different. He saw resolve. All right, Nathaniel said. But understand this, if we're doing this, we're doing it right. No shortcuts. No half measures. Raymond nodded firmly. Agreed. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Nathaniel thought back to the boy Raymond used to be, the one who had looked up to him, who had once believed in justice before the system had hardened him. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a part of that boy left. Raymond stood, adjusting his belt. I'll call you later this week. We'll start putting a plan together. Nathaniel nodded. I'll be waiting. As the police chief walked away, Nathaniel turned his gaze back to the park. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something stirring in his chest. Hope. It wasn't enough yet. But it was a start. The afternoon sun filtered through the branches of the towering oak trees, casting dappled shadows across the well-worn paths of Oakwood Park. Nathaniel remained seated on his usual bench, the meeting with Raymond still weighing on his mind. He had been down this road before, too many promises, too many failed reforms. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was Raymond's sincerity, or maybe it was the urgency in the air, a collective sense that things had to change. Either way, Nathaniel knew he couldn't let this opportunity slip away. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. He looked up to see Chinas walking toward him, her expression thoughtful. She sat down beside him without a word, setting her purse in her lap and watching the children playing in the distance. For a while, neither of them spoke, simply absorbing the moment. "I heard about the meeting," she finally said, turning to him. "Jamal told me it was intense." Nathaniel let out a slow breath. "That's one way to put it." Chinas shifted, folding her arms. "Did it feel real? Like, do you think they actually care?" Nathaniel took a moment before answering. "Some of them do. Some of them are just going through the motions. And some are still holding on to the same old way of thinking, refusing to see the problem." Chinas nodded, her jaw tightening. "Sounds about right." They sat in silence again before she asked, "So what happens now?" Nathaniel turned toward her, studying her face. There was a fire in her eyes, the same determination he had seen in young activists decades ago, the same hunger for justice. He saw himself in her, in all of them, really. Marcus, Jamal, Maria. They were the next generation of fighters, the ones who would carry the torch forward. "I had a talk with Raymond after the meeting," Nathaniel said. "He wants to put together a real reform program. Community engagement, better training, actual consequences for bad policing. He asked for my help." Chinas' eyes widened slightly. "And what did you say?" Nathaniel smirked. "I told him if we're doing this, we're doing it right. No shortcuts." She let out a breath, shaking her head. "Wow. So, you think this could actually work?" Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I think it's a start. But it's only going to work if we stay involved, if we hold them accountable every step of the way. This can't just be their initiative. It has to be ours too." Chinas nodded, chewing on her bottom lip as she processed his words. "Then I want in." Nathaniel smiled, already expecting her response. "I figured you would." A light breeze rolled through the park, rustling the leaves above them. In the distance, a group of teenagers passed by, laughing and joking as they skateboarded along the path. Nathaniel watched them for a moment, then turned back to Chinas. "This isn't just about the police," he said. "It's about everything. The way we're seen, the way we're treated. It's about making sure kids like those never have to question if they belong in their own neighborhood." Chinas exhaled sharply. "I want that too. And I know Marcus, Jamal, and Maria do too." "Good," Nathaniel said. "Because we're going to need every one of you." As if summoned by the conversation, Marcus and Jamal appeared on the path, heading in their direction. Marcus had his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable, while Jamal was mid-sentence, clearly deep in thought about something. When they spotted Nathaniel and Chinas, they made their way over, settling into the bench across from them. "Didn't expect to find you both here," Marcus said, his voice calm but curious. "We were just talking about next steps," Nathaniel replied. Jamal leaned back against the bench, stretching out his legs. "Man, I've been thinking about that meeting all day. I still can't believe some of those officers acted like they were the victims in all this." Nathaniel sighed. "People don't like being told they're part of the problem. Some of them genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. Others just don't want to admit they have biases." Marcus scoffed. "Biases? Call it what it is, racism. That Officer Daniels wasn't just biased. He saw an old black man sitting in the park and decided he didn't belong there. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a power trip." Jamal nodded in agreement. "And what about all the people who let it happen? Who didn't speak up, didn't step in? They're just as bad." Chinas ran a hand through her braids, looking between them. "I get it. Trust me, I do. But if we want to fix this, we have to be willing to do the work. Nathaniel's been fighting this fight longer than we've been alive. And if he thinks there's a real shot at change, then we owe it to ourselves to try." Marcus glanced at Nathaniel, his face unreadable. Then he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Fine. But if I see them trying to sweep this under the rug, I'm calling it out. I'm not playing their game. Neither am I, Nathaniel assured him. That's why we stay involved. That's why we stay loud. Jamal cracked his knuckles. All right then. What's the plan? Nathaniel sat up straighter, a new energy settling in his bones. First, we push for the Community Oversight Board. Not just something symbolic, something with real authority, the ability to hold officers accountable. Second, we work with Raymond on the training program, making sure it actually addresses the problem and isn't just a PR move. And third, he paused, looking at each of them. We make sure this doesn't stop at the police. We fight for better schools, better job opportunities, better protections for our people. We make sure our voices are heard in every space where decisions are being made. Chinas sat up. That's a lot. Nathaniel nodded. It is. But real change takes work. Marcus ran a hand down his face, then finally sighed. All right. Let's do it. Jamal clapped his hands together. Guess we're in this for the long haul. Nathaniel smiled. That's the only way to do it. They sat there for a while longer, going over ideas, making plans. By the time they parted ways, the sky had begun to darken, the first hints of evening settling over the park. Nathaniel watched them go, his heart full in a way he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was carrying this fight alone. The following morning, Nathaniel rose early, his mind already buzzing with thoughts about their next steps. He had been fighting for justice longer than he cared to admit, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the fire in the eyes of the young people who had stepped up to fight alongside him, or maybe it was the undeniable shift in the air, the sense that the community was ready to demand change. Either way, he knew they couldn't afford to lose momentum. By midday, he found himself seated in the community center with Marcus, Chinas, Jamal, and Maria. The room had an old familiarity to it, a space that had once hosted meetings during the civil rights movement, back when Nathaniel was the one sitting on the other side of the table, absorbing lessons from those who came before him. Now, it was his turn to guide the next generation, and he took that responsibility seriously. I spoke to Raymond this morning, Nathaniel said, addressing the group. He's meeting with the mayor in 2 days to discuss the oversight board. He wants us to draft a list of key demands, things we won't compromise on. Marcus leaned forward, his expression hard. So, what's stopping them from just giving us a watered-down version of what we're asking for? Something that looks good on paper but doesn't actually do anything. Nathaniel nodded. That's why we need to be specific. We're not just asking for a board, we're asking for a board with real authority. That means disciplinary power, independent investigations, and community representation. Maria flipped open her notebook. I did some research last night. Other cities have tried this, but the ones that failed all had the same issue. The police department had too much influence over the board. If we're going to do this, we need to make sure it's truly independent. Jamal nodded. And we need to be smart about how we push for it. If we go in just making demands, they'll find a way to shut us down. We need to come with solutions, not just complaints. Chinas tapped her fingers against the table. So how do we make them listen? A press conference? A protest? Nathaniel considered for a moment. Both? We make sure the public is watching. If the mayor knows there's community pressure, she'll be more inclined to take this seriously. Marcus smirked. You know the media loves a good story. Local activists demand justice, sounds like a headline to me. Maria leaned in. And we should have testimonies from people who've been directly impacted. My cousin was harassed by the police last year for no reason. People need to hear those stories. Nathaniel looked around the table, taking in their determination. They were young, but they were ready. More than ready. All right, he said. Here's what we do. We draft the proposal tonight. Tomorrow, we gather support, letters from local organizations, business leaders, faith groups, anyone who can put pressure on the mayor's office. Then, we plan the press conference for the morning of the meeting. We need to show them that this isn't just us, this is the whole community demanding change. Jamal grinned. Let's make some noise. By the time the sun set, they had mapped out every detail. Maria and Jamal would draft the official proposal, ensuring that every demand was backed by data and legal precedent. Chinas and Marcus would handle outreach, securing endorsements from key community figures. Nathaniel, with his decades of experience, would prepare to lead the press conference, his voice carrying the weight of generations. As they wrapped up the meeting, Nathaniel caught Marcus lingering behind, his arms crossed over his chest. "You got something on your mind?" Nathaniel asked. Marcus hesitated before speaking. "You really think this is gonna work?" Nathaniel studied him for a moment. "It's gonna take work. It's gonna take persistence. But yes, I believe it will." Marcus exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It just feels like, I don't know. Like no matter how hard we push, they'll find a way to keep things the same." Nathaniel placed a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You know what my father used to tell me? The only time you lose a fight is when you stop fighting. You don't stop. Even when they push back, even when it feels like nothing's changing, you keep going. That's how we win." Marcus held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Let's win this thing." The next morning, their plan was in motion. While Maria and Jamal finalized the proposal, Chinas and Marcus hit the streets, speaking with pastors, business owners, and community leaders. The response was overwhelming. People were tired of the fear, tired of the injustice, tired of feeling like their voices didn't matter. By noon, they had secured over a dozen endorsements, with more coming in. At the same time, Nathaniel reached out to his contacts in the media. He had spent years cultivating relationships with journalists who cared about real stories, and today, he needed them to pay attention. By the afternoon, several reporters had already confirmed their attendance at the press conference. By nightfall, everything was set. Nathaniel sat alone in his living room, a cup of tea in his hand, staring out the window at the quiet street. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. He had walked these roads before, fought these battles, and yet here they were again. But this time, it felt different. This time, they had a plan. This time, they had a community behind them. This time, they were ready. As the clock struck midnight, his phone buzzed. A text from Chinas. "We're all in. Tomorrow, we make them listen." The morning of the press conference arrived with a crisp breeze sweeping through the neighborhood. The sun had barely risen, but the community center was already alive with movement. Nathaniel stood at the podium, adjusting the microphone while Maria handed out copies of their proposal to the gathered reporters. The energy in the room was palpable, anticipation mixed with determination. Marcus paced near the entrance, his phone in hand. "We've got at least 3 news stations covering this live," he said, his voice a mixture of excitement and nerves. "Local papers are here too." Chinas stood beside him, nodding. "And I just got word that a few city council members might be watching. They know this isn't something they can ignore." Nathaniel took in the sight of the young leaders, their determination reminding him of a time when he stood in their shoes, fighting battles that felt insurmountable. But today, there was something different. This wasn't just another fight, this was a reckoning. He stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat, and looked out at the faces before him. Members of the press, community elders, concerned citizens, and even a few hesitant police officers stood watching. The cameras clicked as the crowd quieted. "Good morning," Nathaniel began, his voice strong. "My name is Nathaniel Reed. Many of you know me as a lifelong member of this community. Some of you know me as an old man who spends his mornings in the park. But today, I stand before you as a citizen demanding change." He let his words settle before continuing. "A few weeks ago, I was harassed in the very park I helped design. I was asked to prove that I belonged in a neighborhood I have called home for over 50 years. And while that moment was humiliating, it was not unique. Too many of us, especially young black men and women, live with the daily reality of being questioned, of being seen as a threat, simply for existing." A murmur ran through the crowd. Marcus nodded, stepping forward. "That's why we're here today," he added. "This is bigger than one incident. It's about a system that allows bias to go unchecked. We refuse to accept that any longer." Maria took the microphone next, her presence poised and confident. "We are calling for an independent community oversight board for the police department. A board with real power to investigate misconduct, to hold officers accountable, and to ensure that the people they serve are not treated as second-class citizens in their own neighborhoods." Jamal stepped up, holding up a copy of their proposal. This isn't just talk. We've done our research. We've studied oversight models that work. We've outlined how it can be implemented here. No more delays, no more empty promises, we need action. Nathaniel scanned the crowd, taking in the reactions. Some reporters scribbled notes, others listened intently. A few officers shifted uncomfortably, but at least they were listening. That was a start. Then, a voice rang out from the back of the room. Do you really think this will make a difference? Or is this just another protest that leads to nothing? A hush fell over the room. Nathaniel took a deep breath, his eyes meeting those of the reporter who had spoken. Let me tell you a story, he said. 50 years ago, people asked the same thing when we demanded the right to vote. They asked the same thing when we fought to desegregate schools, when we demanded fair housing. And yet, change happened. Because people refused to back down. He let the weight of his words settle. We are not here to ask for permission. We are here to claim what is rightfully ours: justice, accountability, and the ability to walk through our neighborhoods without fear. And yes, this will make a difference. Because we will make sure it does. Applause rippled through the room. Maria and Marcus exchanged a glance, the fire in their eyes burning brighter than ever. They were making waves, and people were listening. As the press conference wrapped up, a familiar figure approached Nathaniel. Chief Raymond Mitchell stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. You know you've put me in a tough spot, Mitchell said. Nathaniel gave a knowing smile. Good. That means you're paying attention. The chief exhaled, shaking his head. The mayor saw the press conference. She's calling for a meeting with you and your team. Tomorrow morning. A wave of triumph swept over the group. This was exactly what they had wanted. I hope you're ready, Mitchell added, glancing at the young leaders. Because the real fight starts now. Nathaniel placed a firm hand on the chief's shoulder. We've been ready. The next morning, the air inside City Hall was thick with tension. Nathaniel, Maria, Marcus, and Chena stood outside the mayor's office, their expressions set with determination. They had spent the night preparing for this meeting, going over every detail of their proposal, every counter-argument they might face. This wasn't just another meeting, it was a turning point. Mayor Evelyn Rodriguez's secretary ushered them into the office, where the mayor sat behind a sleek mahogany desk. Chief Mitchell was already there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Seated across from the mayor were two city council members and the police commissioner, a stern-looking man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes. Please, have a seat, the mayor said, gesturing toward the chairs in front of her. The group settled in, exchanging brief glances before Nathaniel cleared his throat. Madam Mayor, thank you for meeting with us, he began, his voice steady. I'm sure you're aware of why we're here. The mayor nodded. Your press conference made quite an impact. The calls to my office haven't stopped since yesterday. The police commissioner leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. Let's be clear about something, he said. We take community concerns seriously. But you're asking for an independent oversight board with full investigatory powers. That's a drastic step. Maria didn't hesitate. A necessary step, she countered. Complaints against officers are currently handled internally, with little transparency. People don't trust that process, and frankly, they have no reason to. Councilwoman Hart, a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair, spoke up. There's been oversight before, but it hasn't worked the way you're proposing. Marcus leaned forward. Because it was never real oversight. Advisory boards with no actual power won't cut it anymore. We need a board that can investigate complaints, subpoena officers when necessary, and ensure real consequences for misconduct. The room fell silent for a moment before Chief Mitchell finally spoke. I won't lie, he said, rubbing his chin. This would change the way we do things. And it wouldn't be easy. But it would be right, Nathaniel said firmly. The mayor let out a long breath, tapping her pen against her desk. Even if we agreed in principle, implementing something like this requires legal framework, funding, and support from the council. Then let's make that happen, Chena said. The city finds funding for things it deems important. If police accountability isn't important enough to invest in, then we have a bigger problem. The mayor glanced at the police commissioner, then at Chief Mitchell, who met her gaze without flinching. After a long moment, she nodded. Fine. I'll back the formation of a working group to explore the logistics of an independent oversight board. But I want community representatives involved. "We accept," Nathaniel said without hesitation. "But," the mayor continued, "this will take time. It's not something we can create overnight." Marcus leaned back, folding his arms. "Then we'll be here every step of the way to make sure it happens." The meeting ended with a mixture of tension and progress. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a start. As they walked out of City Hall, the group exchanged glances. "We did it," Maria said, barely believing the words herself. Nathaniel nodded. "Now the real work begins." Over the next few weeks, the momentum only grew stronger. The city's decision to form a working group to establish an independent oversight board made headlines, and public pressure continued to mount. Community meetings were held across different neighborhoods, with residents sharing their experiences and expectations. Maria, Marcus, Chinas, and Nathaniel found themselves at the center of it all, working tirelessly to ensure the voices of the people were heard. One evening, a town hall was held at the local community center, packed to capacity with citizens, activists, and even some police officers who had come to listen. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of hope, frustration, and cautious optimism. Chief Mitchell stood at the front, addressing the crowd. "This initiative isn't about attacking law enforcement," he said. "It's about accountability. It's about making sure that those who serve and protect do so with integrity and fairness." A man in the audience raised his hand. "What guarantees do we have that this board won't just be another advisory committee with no real power?" "That's exactly what we're fighting to avoid," Maria answered, stepping forward. "This board needs teeth. The ability to investigate misconduct, issue recommendations, and hold officers accountable in a meaningful way." An older woman near the back of the room, her hair wrapped in a vibrant scarf, shook her head. "We've been promised change before. We've marched, protested, spoken at meetings. How do we know this time will be any different?" Nathaniel took a deep breath before responding. "Because this time, we're not just asking for change. We're demanding it. And we're staying at the table until it happens." Applause rippled through the crowd, but there were still skeptics. A young man in a hoodie stood up. "I got stopped last week for no reason," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "The officer asked me where I was going, what I was doing, like I don't belong in my own neighborhood. Are you telling me this board is going to fix that?" "No single policy will fix everything," Marcus said honestly. "But this is a step toward changing the culture. A system where bad cops face consequences means officers will think twice before abusing their power. And over time, that shift will be felt." The young man didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded, acknowledging the effort. As the meeting wrapped up, people lingered, discussing what they had heard. Chief Mitchell approached Nathaniel, Maria, Marcus, and Chinas. "You handled that well," he said. "This isn't an easy conversation, but it's a necessary one." Nathaniel nodded. "We're just getting started." That night, as they left the community center, the group stood outside under the streetlights, exhausted but energized. The battle for real oversight was far from over, but they had built something undeniable, momentum. And they weren't going to let it slip away. In the days following the town hall, the city council deliberated on the oversight board's formation. Media coverage intensified, with news outlets featuring interviews from community leaders, officers, and everyday citizens who had attended the meetings. Social media was flooded with discussions, some supportive, others skeptical. The movement had reached a point where change was inevitable. The question now was how much power the oversight board would actually have. Nathaniel sat in his small living room, the walls lined with books and framed photos from his younger years. He was reviewing drafts of proposed policies when his phone rang. It was Maria. "The city council is set to vote tomorrow," she said. "We need to make sure people show up. We can't let them water this down." "I'll make some calls," Nathaniel replied. "We need every seat in that chamber filled." By morning, the city council hall was packed. Residents, activists, and reporters crowded in, their presence a silent demand for justice. The council members sat at their elevated desks, looking down at the people who had spent months fighting for this moment. Mayor Evelyn Rodriguez cleared her throat, scanning the room before speaking. "This community has come together in a way we haven't seen in years," she began. "What started as an unfortunate incident has led to an important conversation about policing, oversight, and public trust. Today, we decide how we move forward." Council members took turns speaking. Some praised the proposal, others expressed concerns. Councilman Avery, an older politician with a reputation for opposing reforms, leaned forward. "We need to be careful," he warned. "This board could tie the hands of law enforcement. We don't want officers hesitating when making split-second decisions." Maria stood up, her voice steady. "No one is asking for hesitation. We're asking for accountability. An oversight board doesn't punish officers for doing their jobs, it ensures that when misconduct occurs, there are consequences." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Marcus spoke next, his hands gripping the podium. "Without oversight, abuses go unchecked. This isn't about being anti-police, it's about ensuring that the badge represents justice for all." Councilwoman Dawson, one of the younger members, nodded. "We need to restore public trust. People need to feel safe, not just from crime but from the very institutions meant to protect them." As the debate continued, Nathaniel watched from his seat, his hands clasped together. This moment reminded him of past battles he had fought, marches, negotiations, the slow, frustrating push for equality. Change was never easy, but it was necessary. Finally, the vote was called. "All in favor of establishing the Independent Oversight Board, say aye." A pause. Then, one by one, voices rang out. "Aye, aye, aye." There were a few dissenting votes, but it wasn't enough. The motion passed. Applause erupted. Maria exhaled sharply, gripping Chinnis's hand. Marcus clapped Nathaniel on the back. After months of work, they had secured a major victory. But as the cheers settled, Nathaniel leaned in, his voice low but firm. "This is just the beginning." As the news spread across the city, the passing of the Oversight Board felt like a long-awaited victory. But Nathaniel knew that the real work had just begun. Passing a policy was one thing, ensuring it was implemented fairly and effectively was another battle altogether. The following morning, the core team met at the community center, the air buzzing with a mix of triumph and determination. Maria had brought along printed copies of the finalized ordinance, highlighting sections that still needed public input. "We need to push for real representation on this board," she said, scanning the faces around her. "If we let them stack it with political insiders, it won't change anything." Marcus nodded, leaning forward. "And we can't let them underfund it. If they don't have the resources to do proper investigations, it's just for show." Nathaniel listened, a quiet pride settling in his chest. They understood the game. They weren't just celebrating, they were strategizing, thinking ahead, preparing for the next fight. "We need to nominate people who actually understand the community," Nathaniel said. "We need young voices, people who've lived through this. And we need someone with legal expertise, someone who won't be intimidated by pushback. The city will try to dilute its power," Chinnis added. "We have to make sure the board has real authority, real teeth." Over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly, attending every planning meeting, submitting recommendations, and mobilizing the community to apply for board positions. There were moments of resistance. Certain council members tried to slip in provisions that weakened the board's power, and some police unions opposed civilian oversight entirely. But the community was watching now, and every attempt to undermine the board was met with immediate backlash. Nathaniel watched from the sidelines, guiding where needed but letting the younger generation lead. The fire in their voices reminded him of himself decades ago, standing on protest lines, demanding change. He had always believed that progress came when people refused to back down, and now, he was seeing it unfold before him. A week before the final approval of the board members, Maria knocked on Nathaniel's door. "I need to ask you something," she said, stepping inside. "We want you on the board." Nathaniel sighed, shaking his head. "Maria, this is your fight now. I'm here to support, but this belongs to your generation." "That's exactly why we need you," Maria argued. "We need someone with experience, someone who won't be manipulated. You know this system better than anyone." Nathaniel considered her words. He had spent so many years fighting to create opportunities for the next wave of leaders that he hadn't thought about stepping back into the spotlight himself. But maybe, just maybe, he still had one more battle left in him. "I'll think about it," he finally said. Maria grinned. "That's all I needed to hear." The day of the final approval arrived with a tension that hung heavy in the air. The city council chambers were packed, every seat filled with members of the community, activists, and concerned citizens who had fought for this moment. Reporters lined the back of the room, cameras flashing as officials took their seats. The pressure was undeniable, but the determination in the room was even stronger. Nathaniel sat with Maria, Marcus, Chinas, and the rest of the team, his hands folded in his lap as the proceedings began. He had finally agreed to serve on the oversight board, not out of vanity or desire for recognition, but because Maria had been right, experience mattered. Someone had to ensure that the board didn't become a symbolic gesture, something easily ignored. It had to be real. The council members took turns delivering their statements, most of them acknowledging the need for change, though a few still resisted. Councilman Reynolds, one of the more vocal opponents, took the floor. "I understand the concerns that have been raised, but let's not pretend that civilian oversight is a magic solution," Reynolds said, his tone measured but dismissive. "We have processes in place already, and what's needed isn't more bureaucracy, but better collaboration between law enforcement and the community." Nathaniel listened without reaction, though he could feel Marcus shifting beside him, ready to argue. He placed a steadying hand on the younger man's arm. Now wasn't the time. They had already won the vote. The opposition was just making noise. Mayor Evelyn Rodriguez, who had championed the initiative, was the last to speak before the vote. She stood, her expression firm. "This board isn't about targeting law enforcement," she said. "It's about accountability. It's about trust. If we want a safer city, then we need a system where both officers and civilians know that justice is not selective. This is a step toward that goal." The roll call vote began, and the room fell silent, every name called adding to the tension. One by one, the council members cast their votes. Maria gripped the edge of her chair, barely breathing. When the final vote was cast in favor, the chamber erupted into applause. The oversight board was officially approved. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, allowing himself a brief moment of satisfaction. But he knew the real fight was just beginning. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Nathaniel, along with the other selected board members, attended rigorous training sessions on legal procedures, investigative protocols, and the responsibilities of the board. Each meeting brought new challenges, discussions about transparency, about ensuring that their findings actually led to consequences, about resisting political interference. It was exhausting, but Nathaniel had spent his life in battles like this. He knew that change was a long game, fought in increments. One evening, after a particularly intense meeting, Nathaniel found himself walking through Oakwood Park, the place where all of this had begun. The air was cool, the laughter of children still lingering as families packed up for the night. The park, a symbol of community, stood as a reminder of what had been achieved and what was still at stake. Maria found him there, as if knowing where he would be. "You okay?" she asked, sitting beside him on the bench. Nathaniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the Thompson Fountain, named after his old friend who had fought so many of these same battles before him. "Just thinking," he said. Maria followed his gaze. "You did it, you know. All of this. It wouldn't have happened without you." Nathaniel shook his head. "No. We did it. You, Marcus, Chinas, everyone who refused to back down. I just did what I've always done, kept pushing." Maria smiled, leaning back. "Still, I hope you know what you mean to this city." Nathaniel chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm just a man who lived long enough to see history repeat itself. My only hope is that this time, we get it right." Maria was quiet for a moment, then said, "We will. And when you're ready to step back, we'll keep it going." Nathaniel glanced at her, seeing in her the future he had always fought for. A leader who didn't need permission to change the world. He smiled. "I know." As the last traces of sunlight faded, the two of them sat in comfortable silence, the sound of the fountain filling the space between them. The work was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel believed that maybe, just maybe, change was here to stay.